The president's announcement, set to take place in the White House Rose Garden, is being called Make America Wealthy Again. That's despite warnings from economists virtually across the board that actually reciprocal tariffs against trading partners will make things more expensive for Americans and also make a U.S. recession more likely. Trump says he has finally settled on his tariff plan, though the White House says he's still working through the numbers with his advisors. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt says that whatever the plan of action, the tariffs are, in the administration's view, necessary and long overdue.
The president will be addressing the decades of unfair trade practices that have ripped our country off and American workers off. It has hollowed out our middle class. It has destroyed our heartland, and the president is focused on reshifting our global economy to ensure that America is once again the manufacturing superpower of the world.
The White House says the tariffs announced tomorrow will take effect immediately. U.S. stocks finished Tuesday sessions mostly higher. Despite these new uncertainties, U.S. Senate Democrats are challenging Trump's sweeping 25% tariffs specifically on Canada. Announced back in February, they're set to hold a vote this week aimed at scrapping the national emergency grounds that underpins Trump's tariffs. They say the president overstated the fentanyl emergency on the northern border in order to give him legal cover for those tariffs.
The president has justified the imposition of these tariffs on, in my view, a made-up emergency. Fentanyl is a real emergency in this country. Let's be clear about that. Fentanyl is a real emergency. But as President Trump's national security advisor, Tulsi Gabbard, testified before Mark's Intel Committee last week, the fentanyl emergency is from Mexico and China. It's not from Canada.
President Trump is now demanding that all Senate Republicans vote against the measure and keep the national emergency grounds in place. In a Truth Social post, he said a victory would be, quote, devastating for the Republican Party and for the United States. The measure, however, we should note, is mostly symbolic because it is highly unlikely to be taken up by the Republican-controlled House. Earlier, I spoke to Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, about the broader trade war, as well as news that the heads of Mexico and Canada discussed tariffs in a phone call today, suggesting the two countries might offer a joint response to Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Have a listen.
Well, we've been working together. The foreign minister of Mexico and I have been in close contact for many weeks now. It's been more than 90 days that we've been dealing with different executive orders coming out of the White House that are affecting our economies. But it was an introduction call. It was the first time the Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister Carney, and President Sheinbaum were talking, and we're both very important trading partners. Mexico is the second biggest trading partner to Canada, but also we're part of the USMCA, this trade agreement that is also so key right now, and that we need to see whether we can continue to work on to keep it strong. And this is certainly a message that we wanted to make sure that the Mexican government heard from their Canadian friends.
As you know, the Prime Minister, Carney, he warned that the old U.S. relationship that Canada had with the U.S. is over, stating, quote, the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. I wonder, what does that mean exactly? How will the trading relationship change between the U.S. and Canada, but also the defense partnership?
Well, we didn't launch a trade war against the U.S. The U.S. Decided to put 25% tariffs against all our products in their first executive order, then went after us by putting 25% tariffs on our steel and aluminum, then went after us putting 25% on our auto sector, and now we're looking at potentially being vulnerable to reciprocal tariffs. Meanwhile, we wanted to make sure that we were sending a clear message that we were retaliating. And at this point, we've put $60 billion worth of tariffs against products in Canada. And also we have $100 billion more of potential counter tariffs against the U.S. So on American products in Canada. Canada is the biggest client of the U.S. Jim, you've asked me that question in the past. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're in business, and I know many people watching us right now are in the business sector, you treat your client, your best client, well. And so our goal is to make sure that we end this trade war, that we get to a common understanding that this is hurting our Canadians and Americans, their wallets, and nobody's winning from it. But at the same time, of course, we want to make sure that we work with the White House. Of course, we want to make sure that we find an off-ramp. Of course, we're willing to have discussions, and that's my goal, working with Marco Rubio. But also, this is the goal of the Prime Minister, talking to the President, and as well the Secretary of Commerce and the Minister of International Trade here in Canada.
But the Prime Minister's words speak to something more lasting here. And it's not just him who's saying this. It's many Canadians themselves, right, who are quite voluntarily stopping buying U.S. products or canceling visits to the U.S. I wonder, who will Canada look to be a more reliable trading partner if the U.S. is no longer that reliable partner?
Well, we understand that we're now in an era of protectionism, and our entire country has been built on free trade amongst our provinces, but there's been many barriers to commerce within Canada, and we think that we can really do a better job at supporting ourselves inside our country. We're also looking, of course, at Europe. Canada's the most most European country of all the non-European countries, Jim. We're definitely looking at Japan and South Korea and looking at Asia. We're, of course, looking at Mexico. But fundamentally, Canadians have really good relationship with Americans. We're your best friends. We're your best neighbors, your best allies. And so we want to make sure that, well, we're putting maximum pressure on the Trump administration to make sure that they're backing off on their trade war, that we can find a way to find a solution. But on the security side, we know we need to invest more in our own industry. We need to rely more on our defense sector. We need to create jobs at home. We need to defend our own Arctic. And that's also the job we will be doing. We're now in campaign mode here back home in Canada. So we need to make sure that we have a strong mandate on the part of Canadians to make sure that we're sending also a message to the American administration that we stand up for Canadians.
It sounds like you're leaving the door open to some sort of reconciliation here. Do you have some hope, some optimism that perhaps President Trump will back off some of the worst trade threats? Because that's not, that doesn't seem to be the signals coming from the White House.
I'm in charge of diplomacy in Canada. My job is always to make sure that we put maximum pressure, that when I say maximum pressure, that we use all the tools in our toolkit to ultimately have this trade war end. But in the end of the day, we know there's going to be a negotiating table. That's the case in every war, including trade wars. And in that sense, we need to send a clear message now to Canadians, to Americans. And this is my way to make sure that ultimately we get to a good position at the negotiation table. That's why we're keeping our counter tariffs in place. That's why also we're the only country on earth that has put so much retaliatory tariffs on the table. Of course, we're talking with other countries. Of course, we're talking to the EU. Of course, we're talking to Mexico. Of course, we're talking to Japan and South Korea. Because what we're seeing right now is all these different tariffs are affecting ultimately jobs here at home, but also creating inflation across the board in many economies, and first and foremost in the US. And that's my message to Americans watching us right now, is tariffs are a tax on you, your family, and affecting also your wallets, of course.
Before we go, when we last spoke, you said that if Trump were to impose these sweeping tariffs, the U.S. and Canada would be in a trade war. And I wonder, are you in a trade war now?
Of course we are. We are. They've imposed executive orders against us. And that's why you've been hearing me using the term, Jim. And we didn't start this trade war. The U.S. administration did. And they can reverse course, but they can only reverse course if the American people themselves say it's enough, that they want to make sure that we get to a good place and we're able to ultimately get rid of these tariffs and also have a better relationship between Canada and the US. We've never seen this in decades. We were caught by surprise by this intention of launching this trade war, but we're a strong country, we're proud people, we're hardworking, and we always defend ourselves, and we will continue to defend ourselves in the context of this trade war.
There you have it from the Canadian Foreign Minister. The U.S. and Canada, neighbors, treaty allies, now in a trade war.